Shockwaves hit Washington as Caroline Leavitt, the chief spokesperson for the 47th president, completely unraveled during a 4-minute press briefing, a public meltdown that sent the media into overdrive. In a moment that demanded clarity, the nation got chaos. Questions were met not with answers, but with visible discomfort, prolonged silences, and contradictory statements. And the question that triggered it all? A basic one. Why are taxpayers funding billionaires while everyday Americans can't afford groceries? Instead of responding, Leavitt deflected, twice, then stood frozen. The silence was deafening. According to CNN's political correspondent, Abby Phillip, this press event marked one of the weakest public communication moments of any modern White House. The moment quickly spiraled into a media crisis, exposing a deeper issue. There is no coherent economic narrative coming from this administration. Even the Washington Post reported that several senior staffers were caught off guard by Leavitt's appointment, citing her limited federal policy experience and lack of crisis management training. And behind the silence, the real problem looms: a government unprepared to defend its economic strategy in public view, because it doesn't have one. CNN, April 7, 2025. Abby Phillip calls the press briefing one of the most damaging communication missteps from the White House in years. The Washington Post, April 6, 2025. An internal report reveals Caroline Leavitt lacks experience handling federal-level media crises. The Wall Street Journal, April 5, 2025. An analysis highlights inconsistencies in the economic messaging coming from the current administration. China moved with ruthless precision. Within hours of the U.S. tariff threat, Beijing rerouted its LNG shipments to Europe, locking down strategic energy deals that Washington could only watch from the sidelines. Germany, the Netherlands, and Italy scrambled to rewrite their import policies, hungry for affordable LNG to break free from Russian dependence. While the U.S. once envisioned dominating global LNG exports, it now finds itself cut out, casualties of its own economic aggression. China's pivot isn't just economic, it's geopolitical. By undercutting U.S. gas prices and locking in multi-year deals with EU nations, Beijing is reshaping the energy map of Europe. According to Reuters, March 4, 2025, China has quadrupled its LNG exports to Europe in Q1 2025 alone, exploiting gaps left by stalled U.S. shipments. Meanwhile, CNBC reports that U.S. exporters are facing delays and contract cancellations as European buyers chase cheaper Chinese alternatives. The consequence? America is no longer the energy savior Europe once hoped for. It's become the outsider, outmaneuvered, outpaced, and out of touch. Reuters, April 3, 2025. China quadruples LNG exports to Europe in Q1 2025. CNBC, April 4, 2025. Contract cancellations surge among U.S. LNG exporters as Europe pivots to Chinese suppliers. Financial Times, April 2, 2025. Europe builds long-term gas infrastructure around Chinese suppliers, signaling a global energy trade realignment. As Europe scrambles to secure energy independence post-Russia, billions are flowing. But not to the United States. Massive investments are now pouring into LNG terminals, underground storage, and cross-border transmission networks. But they're being signed with China and Australia, not Washington. According to Financial Times, the EU's energy pivot has redirected $48 billion in infrastructure contracts toward Asia-Pacific allies, leaving the U.S. out in the cold. The consequence is brutal. America has lost leverage, market share, and strategic influence in a region that once depended on it. Meanwhile, Australia has quietly signed a $1.5 billion LNG export deal with the EU, locking in multi-year access to the continent's ports and grid infrastructure. U.S. markets are in freefall, but allies are moving on. This isn't just a missed opportunity, it's a full-blown strategic collapse. As Bloomberg noted last week, the U.S. overplayed its energy hand. Now Europe is hedging its future elsewhere. Financial Times, April 2025. EU redirects $48 billion in LNG infrastructure spending to Asian suppliers. Bloomberg, March 2025. Australia secures $1.5 billion LNG export deal with the European Union. Wall Street Journal, April 2025. U.S. LNG exporters face freeze-out as Europe diversifies away from American energy. As the world watches America's credibility erode, the White House press office offers evasions. When asked why Trump privately told automakers not to raise prices while publicly vowing tariffs on other countries, the spokesperson responded with a vague, "I'm not sure." The contradiction is glaring and damaging. According to CNBC, U.S. auto manufacturers are already warning that price control by political pressure could disrupt supply chains and violate basic market principles. Worse, when pressed about a classified military leak that reportedly occurred via a civilian messaging app, the spokesperson's chilling reply was, "The case is closed. No accountability, no details, no urgency." According to the Washington Post, the leak involved detailed strategic deployments of U.S. assets in the Indo-Pacific. And yet, the White House dismisses it like a traffic ticket. This isn't just a press failure, it's a governance failure. America's trade policy is incoherent, its military secrets are exposed, and its leadership responds with shrugs. The American people deserve answers, not gaslighting. CNBC, April 2025. U.S. automakers push back on Trump's behind-the-scenes pricing directives amid tariff confusion. The Washington Post, April 2025. Leaked U.S. military strategy documents via Signal app raise serious questions. Reuters, March 2025. White House silence deepens security concerns after unauthorized Indo-Pacific plan disclosures. This is not leadership. It's deflection. After a military intelligence leak through an unsecured messaging platform, the only response from the White House was 3 empty words. Veterans and military families, the very people who risk their lives for national security, are being met with silence. According to Military Times, this is the 3rd major breach in less than 18 months, yet there's no clear accountability from the administration. On the economic front, retired Americans, already vulnerable, are being crushed by tariff-driven stock volatility. A simple question from the press, "Do you even listen to them?" went unanswered. That's not just negligence, it's contempt. Reuters reports that since the tariff escalation in early Q1 2025, retirement accounts have lost over $1.2 trillion in value. Many of these Americans are on fixed incomes, and they're being forced to cut food, delay medical treatments, and postpone rent, all because of chaotic, inconsistent trade policy. Military Times, March 2025. 3rd largest national security breach since 2023. Military families demand transparency. CNN, April 2025. White House pushed civilian messaging app use amid leaked military communications. Reuters, April 2025. $1.2 trillion wiped from retirement portfolios since January due to tariff-driven volatility. CNBC, April 2025. Seniors on fixed incomes hit hardest as markets whiplash under uncertain trade outlook. This deal isn't just a sale. It's a strategic humiliation for the United States. While the White House clings to outdated energy policy, its closest military ally just signed a 15-year LNG pact with America's largest geopolitical rival. According to Bloomberg, this is one of the largest energy contracts Australia has ever signed, and the U.S. wasn't even in the conversation. Price? Australia beats the U.S. by 20%. Distance? Shipping time cut in half. Stability? A 15-year guaranteed supply. This is a masterclass in economic leverage, and the U.S. just got outplayed. What's worse, Australia is still a member of the Five Eyes Alliance, a cornerstone of U.S. intelligence and military strategy. And yet this deal positions Canberra closer to Beijing in energy dependence than to Washington in security cooperation. And China? It now locks in 600,000 tons of clean energy per year without touching a single American supplier, sidestepping Washington's tariffs and influence completely. Bloomberg, March 2025. Woodside signs landmark 15-year LNG deal with China's largest gas distributor. Reuters, March 2025. Australian LNG surges to top choice for Asia, outpacing U.S. on both cost and logistics. Financial Times, March 2025. Canberra pivots. China-Australia energy ties deepen despite Western tensions. CNBC, April 2025. U.S. LNG exports stall as Asia turns to faster, cheaper Australian suppliers. It's a catastrophic energy divorce, and Washington barely noticed. In just 5 years, China has cut its imports of U.S. gas by 95%. Once a major customer, the world's second-largest economy now sees U.S. gas as a commodity. Why? Retaliation, strategy, survival. Beijing never forgot the 2019 tariffs, and LNG became the first strategic choke point to be cut. By diversifying to Australia, Qatar, and Russia, China not only secured its energy security, but also weaponized trade policy. According to Reuters, Chinese energy companies are now prioritizing geopolitical alignment over market pricing, a seismic shift that has left the U.S. gas industry in a difficult position. Meanwhile, U.S. LNG producers are facing growing stockpiles and falling export volumes. CNBC reports that U.S. LNG shipments to Asia are down more than 20% year-on-year, putting enormous pressure on domestic suppliers and pipeline infrastructure. This isn't just trade, it's economic warfare by omission. China doesn't need to punish the U.S., it simply turns its back. Reuters, March 2025. U.S. LNG imports from China fall below 5% amid geopolitical tensions. Bloomberg, March 2025. Beijing redirects energy supply to allies. Qatar and Australia ramp up LNG exports to China. CNBC, April 2025. U.S. LNG exports to Asia drop 22%. Tariff legacy continues to haunt the energy sector. Financial Times, March 2025. China redraws the LNG map, sidelining U.S. suppliers in East Asia. This is not just a trade adjustment, but a geopolitical divorce. By cutting U.S. LNG imports from nearly 20% to 4%, China is striking a precise blow to a vital U.S. export industry. And it's not temporary, the pullback is set in decades-long contracts. According to Bloomberg, China's 27-year LNG deal with Qatar Energy, signed in 2022, locks in 4 million tons per year, a strategic move that leaves U.S. exporters on the sidelines. Meanwhile, Reuters reports that China's upcoming East Asia pipeline from Russia will supply up to 50 billion cubic meters a year, replacing U.S. shipments with a more politically connected source. The Australian pivot is equally bold. Despite tensions elsewhere, energy and minerals are outside the scope of diplomatic infighting. China is locking in joint ventures with Woodside and BHP, securing long-term access to LNG and lithium, while U.S. suppliers face growing order cancellations and oversupply. According to CNBC, U.S. LNG exporters are now aggressively redirecting shipments to Europe, but at a steep discount, cutting profit margins by as much as 18%. This isn't just a loss of revenue, it's a loss of leverage. Economic, political, and strategic. Bloomberg, 2024. China signs 27-year LNG supply deal with Qatar Energy, sidelining U.S. rivals. Reuters, 2025. Russia-China-East Asia gas pipeline on track for 2027, reshaping global flows. CNBC, April 2025. US LNG redirected to Europe as China steps away. Exporters lose 18% in margins. Financial Times, 2025. Australia gains edge in critical minerals and LNG partnerships with Beijing. The U.S. LNG sector isn't just losing contracts, it's bleeding relevance. According to Reuters, after China halted long-term purchases of U.S. LNG in late 2024, over $12 billion in projected deals were frozen or canceled outright. Export terminals from Sabine Pass to Freeport are sitting on unused capacity, while storage tanks are overflowing with stranded gas. Meanwhile, Bloomberg reports that Australia signed over $20 billion in new LNG deals in Q1 2025, including long-term contracts with China National Petroleum Corp. And Korea Gas Corporation. This firmly positions Australia as Asia's new LNG backbone, replacing the U.S. in its former stronghold. Worse still, the cost to reroute unsold LNG to Europe has skyrocketed, with CNBC noting a 33% increase in transatlantic freight rates and reduced demand due to mild winters. U.S. firms are now offloading gas at a loss just to clear inventory. Financial Times calls it a geopolitical correction, where energy exports are now dictated by alliances, not just affordability. While Australia gains ground through neutrality and consistency, America pays the price for policy volatility. Reuters, March 2025. China suspends new U.S. LNG contracts amid trade dispute. $12 billion in deals put on hold. Bloomberg, April 2025. Australia secures $20 billion in LNG contracts across Asia, replacing U.S. suppliers. CNBC, March 2025. Transatlantic LNG shipping rates surge 33% as excess U.S. capacity floods the market. Financial Times, 2025. Energy trade now driven by geopolitics, not just price. U.S. LNG faces structural rethink. The numbers don't lie. Trump's 2025 tariff blitz has detonated a trade bomb on U.S. exporters. According to Bloomberg, American agricultural exports to China plummeted by 45% within just 6 weeks of the new tariff. Wheat, soybeans, and pork were the hardest hit, causing panic in rural economies already burdened by high input costs. Meanwhile, Reuters reports that China doubled its purchases of Canadian crude oil and LNG, signing new multi-year contracts worth over $9.7 billion. Europe, too, saw a surge in exports of machinery and automotive components to China, displacing U.S. suppliers. Trump's promise to protect American jobs is now colliding with economic reality. CNBC notes that U.S. manufacturing orders from China fell by 28%, triggering layoffs in key swing states like Michigan and Pennsylvania, ironically, the heart of Trump's political base. Financial Times describes the situation as a self-inflicted trade recession. China didn't just retaliate. It rerouted its supply chains, built alternatives, and reduced reliance on the U.S. permanently. The strategic vacuum was filled not by the U.S., but by its allies. Bloomberg, March 2025. U.S. agricultural exports plunge 45% after February tariffs. Midwest in panic. Reuters, March 2025. China inks $9.7 billion oil and gas deal with Canada amid U.S. trade breakdown. CNBC, March 2025. U.S. factory orders from China drop 28%. Manufacturing jobs at risk. Financial Times, April 2025. America's trade retreat. How the world moves forward without the U.S. A 10% tariff meant to punish Canada ended up crippling U.S. influence in Asia's energy markets. According to Reuters, China signed a multi-year agreement with Canada just 10 days after the tariff took effect, securing over 450,000 barrels per day via the TMX expansion, completely bypassing American suppliers. Bloomberg reports that Canada's upgraded Trans Mountain pipeline has become a strategic corridor to Asia, cutting shipping time by over 9 days and costs by 20% compared to Gulf Coast exports. The consequences are seismic. CNBC warns that U.S. Gulf producers are facing massive inventory buildup as China disappears from their buyer list. And Financial Times highlights that Beijing is now finalizing a 25-year LNG supply deal with British Columbia-based producers, replacing billions in lost American export revenues. By targeting an ally, Trump has triggered a long-term realignment of Asia-Pacific energy flows, leaving the U.S. sidelined in its own geopolitical backyard. Reuters, March 2025. China secures half of Canada's oil output after U.S. tariff rollback. Bloomberg, March 2025. Expanded Trans Mountain pipeline slashes Asia export costs by 20%. CNBC, April 2025. U.S. oil exporters face glut as China shifts supply deals to Canada. Financial Times, April 2025. China eyes 25-year LNG deal with British Columbia. Washington's trade war didn't just isolate American oil, it handed the global LNG crown to its allies. According to Bloomberg, the $40 billion LNG Canada project, backed by Shell, PetroChina, and Mitsubishi, is scheduled to go live in the third quarter of 2025. Once operational, it will become the largest LNG terminal on the Pacific coast of North America, directly targeting Asian buyers. Reuters reports that Beijing has already signed multi-decade offtake agreements with LNG Canada, locking in over 10 million tons per year at rates 15 to 20% lower than U.S. Gulf exports. Meanwhile, CNBC highlights that U.S. LNG terminals are underutilized, with Asia-bound shipments down nearly 30% year-on-year. In contrast, Canada is rapidly scaling up to become the Pacific LNG gateway to China, bypassing U.S. tariffs and Gulf Coast bottlenecks entirely. Financial Times warns this shift is not temporary. Beijing views Canadian LNG as a geopolitically safer bet compared to U.S. supplies entangled in election cycles and sanctions. Bloomberg, March 2025. LNG Canada poised to lead Pacific gas exports as U.S. momentum slows. Reuters, March 2025. China signs long-term supply deal with Canada's major LNG export terminal. CNBC, April 2025. U.S. LNG faces declining Asian demand amid Canadian surge. Financial Times, April 2025. China's pivot to Canadian LNG exposes U.S. vulnerabilities. This isn't just a trade shift, it's an agricultural exodus. According to Bloomberg, U.S. soybean exports to China fell by over 60% between 2018 and 2024. The loss is staggering. An industry worth $14 billion annually is now bleeding out to Brazil and Argentina, who've secured exclusive state contracts with Beijing. Reuters reports China's Ministry of Commerce now actively prioritizes South American imports, citing price stability and geopolitical reliability as core reasons. This isn't about price alone, it's about trust, and Washington has lost it. In 2024, CNBC highlighted that American corn exports to China hit a 7-year low, down over 40%, as Spain and France stepped in to supply high-demand grains. Meanwhile, the Netherlands and Spain, once fringe players, now dominate China's pork imports. The Wall Street Journal warns that U.S. farmers are entering a permanent decline in Chinese market access. The combination of tariffs, political hostility, and aggressive Brazilian trade diplomacy has locked America out of the world's largest food importer. Bloomberg, March 2025. China's soybean pivot cuts deep into U.S. Midwest. Reuters, April 2025. China taps South America over U.S. for strategic food imports. CNBC, April 2025. U.S. corn exports to China down the low 7-year as Europe gained. Wall Street Journal, March 2025. U.S. farmers faces permanent loss of China market shares. The American pork industry is hemorrhaging, and Europe is cashing in. According to Reuters, China's meat imports from Spain and the Netherlands now surpass U.S. shipments for the first time in history, thanks to superior food safety regulations and uninterrupted logistics. In contrast, Bloomberg reports that American pork is now seen as risky, not because of quality, but because of Washington's unstable trade policy. As China tightens import inspections and slaps on retaliatory tariffs, U.S. pork shipments have collapsed. The Wall Street Journal highlights that U.S. pork producers lost over $1.2 billion in export revenue in 2023 alone. The ripple effect is devastating. Excess supply floods domestic markets, pushing prices down by 22%, and small farms are being forced out of business. Meanwhile, Spain's largest pork processors, like Grupo Jorge, are now entering multi-year supply deals with Chinese distributors. This isn't temporary. It's a strategic realignment. Reuters, March 2025. Spain, Netherlands overtake U.S. as top pork suppliers to China. Bloomberg, April 2025. Trade turmoil cuts U.S. pork shipments by half. Wall Street Journal, March 2025. U.S. pig farmers face export collapse amid China shift. CNBC, April 2025. EU firms lock in Chinese pork market as U.S. stumbles. The decline isn't temporary, it's systemic. According to CNBC, U.S. agriculture exports to China have fallen by over 38% since 2023, with soybeans, pork, and cotton taking the biggest hit. Small farms are drowning in debt, while Wall Street firms quietly exit the agricultural commodities space. But the crisis goes beyond farms. China has started systematically defunding its exposure to U.S. tech. A Bloomberg intelligence report reveals that Chinese institutional capital has cut direct investments in U.S. tech firms by 72% since late 2023, citing political risks and trade volatility. Tesla's EV sales in China dropped 24% in Q1 2025, while BYD surged 46%. Intel's AI chip orders were slashed by major Chinese buyers, who are now shifting to European and South Korean alternatives. Even Google Cloud is being shut out of key Chinese enterprise deals, according to Reuters. This isn't just about dollars. It's about the disintegration of U.S. economic leverage. As China realigns with Canada, Germany, Brazil, and South Africa, Washington's grip on global markets is unraveling in real time. CNBC, March 2025. U.S. farm exports to China sink. Small farmers at risk. Bloomberg Intelligence, April 2025. Chinese capital flees U.S. tech in record pullback. Reuters, March 2025. Tesla sales plunge in China as BYD gains dominance. Wall Street Journal, April 2025. China expands tech partnerships with BRICS, cuts U.S. exposure. The U.S. isn't just losing a trade war, it's bleeding economic influence. According to Bloomberg, Canada's agri-exports to China surged 38% in 2024, while the EU's exports of pork, dairy, and tech equipment saw a record 42% increase, replacing U.S. suppliers in key sectors. Reuters reports that Washington's tariff escalation has pushed even U.S. allies to reconsider supply chain partnerships. Germany, once heavily reliant on U.S. semiconductors, has signed a $14 billion bilateral deal with Beijing for next-gen chip and AI tech, bypassing Silicon Valley altogether. Meanwhile, the Wall Street Journal warns that by doubling tariffs, the U.S. risks creating a self-inflicted trade vacuum, with global buyers increasingly seeing America as an unreliable partner. The losers? American exporters shut out of Asia, while Brussels and Ottawa quietly fill the gap. And Beijing is playing chess, not checkers. China's multi-billion-dollar Belt and Road upgrades, now targeting Latin America and Africa, are forming new trade corridors that don't include the U.S. Bloomberg. March 2025. EU, Canada capitalize on U.S.-China trade breakdown. Reuters, April 2025. Germany strikes $14 billion tech pact with China amid U.S. tensions. Wall Street Journal, March 2025. U.S. risks isolation as global supply chains rewire around tariffs. CNBC, April 2025. Beijing's new Belt and Road corridors cut U.S. out.